Good evening. I'm Nancy Scott with the Sierra Nevada Forums. We're very proud to host tonight's forum called Addressing Polarization with Dignity. Our partners are the AAUW Capital Branch, the League of Women Voters of Northern Nevada, and the Nevada Appeal. We're celebrating our 10th year of offering free informational forums to the community, and our mission is to provide citizens with factual, verifiable information to assist them in making well-informed decisions on issues of importance in our community and beyond. Sierra Nevada Forums is solely a community of volunteers. We appreciate your feedback and encourage you to let us know what topics you're interested in hearing about. Tonight's forum, we present on civil discourse with Jill Tolles and Amy Pason and Pat Hickey. These forums would not be possible without the continued support of the Nevada Appeal. The forum is being video recorded, and the footage will appear on the Nevada Appeal website in a couple of days. At the end of their presentation, we will take questions from the audience, and we have a couple of members who will go up and down the aisles collecting questions on an index card. Please put one question on each card, and because of time constraints, we're going to have our panel make sure that the questions are not duplicated, and we might not have time for everything. So, please turn off whatever devices you have that need to be turned off. And with that, I think we will get started with Jill Tolles.
That's all right. I can go ahead and get started. My name is Jill Tolles. I am the executive director of the Guinn Center. Actually, can I just do this? Yep. Great. My name is Jill Tolles. I am the executive director of the Guinn Center for Policy Priorities. And just out of curiosity, how many of you ever had an interaction with Governor Guinn when he was alive? I think one of the most precious things about being the executive director of this center is that everyone has a story who ever met him, and I feel like I've become a collector of his stories. But for those of you who aren't familiar with the Guinn Center, we are a statewide, independent, nonpartisan policy research center. We were started back in 2013 by state and community leaders on both sides of the aisle who looked at the more complex issues that the state of Nevada is facing and decided that we needed a place that we could turn to for factual information and evidence-based policy recommendations to help inform the public and our advocacy community, as well as our main audience, the 63 plus one, the 63 legislators plus the governor. And one of the things that I love about the origin of the Guinn Center is that it was Tom Gallagher, who was a well-known Democrat, ran for Congress at one point, who was the one who suggested that the center be named after a Republican governor who was known as working very well across party lines and also being a champion of education and somebody who knew the budget backwards and forwards. And so the Guinn Center engages in policy research on 5 main categories of topics: education, economic and fiscal policy, health and social policy, governance and civics policy, and then some natural resources and water policy. So hopefully we're up there. Great. Thank you so much. We are a nonprofit governed by a very diverse board across the state. And we affiliated with the University of Nevada, Reno in 2021, which helps us to tap into this incredible brain trust of faculty and graduate students, of which one of our partners is here tonight that we're going to be featuring. We also do work with Boyd Law School and UNLV and subject matter experts across the state and even sometimes out of the state. And over the last 11 years, we've produced over 125 policy research reports and briefs. And I highly recommend, if you have a moment, to go on our guinncenter.org. That's Guinn Center, just like it's spelled up there, just like Kenny Guinn, Guinn, center.org. We just published the Nevada Briefing Book, which is a summary of all of our research over this past interim that we have presented to all 4 caucuses and just finished presenting this afternoon to the Senate Education Committee, to the Assembly Education Committee, and it consists of over 24 reports and briefs on all of the areas that we study. So I highly recommend you look at it. If you like the Cliff Notes version, it represents over 1,000 pages worth of research on everything from housing affordability, early childhood education, pupil-centered funding, school-based adolescent behavioral health issues, among many others, including the hot topic that we just talked about right beforehand, AI in governance and policy, and a lot of explainers on how our election process actually works. We want to provide the public with factual information. And so it's an incredible privilege to be in this position. And before that, before I get to that, this illustration is my brain's way of making sense of why the Guinn Center is so needed in the world today. That when I think about political discourse, often it looks like this, where people come to the table with their own set of facts and perceptions that as we look at this illustration, which one's right? Is it the one that says there's only 3 bars on the floor or there's 4 bars on the floor? And really based on our algorithms, our news feeds, our friends and family, we often think that we are absolutely 100% correct in all the facts that we have. And too often in political discourse, we look across the table and we think that the other person is crazy, stupid, or worse yet, evil. And that's really the foundation behind what we're going to talk about tonight and the importance of dignity in this process. But I always like to point to this illustration that the Guinn Center is not here to take one side or the other, that we're really here to lay out all the relevant facts so that the public can be more informed and that our decision makers can have the best information possible to make the best decisions for our state. Before that, many of you knew me as an assemblywoman, so I served 3 terms in the Nevada State Legislature from 2017 to 2021. And then before that even, I was an education advocate. And I'll never forget the first time I walked in that building across the street and down the way a little bit. I had really no idea how the process worked. I was just a mom and an educator, and I wanted to see us move the needle on education in this state. And I walked up to the law enforcement official behind the desk there and said, "How does this work? What do I do?" And he said something so magical. He said, "This is your house. This is the people's house. Your taxpayer dollars pay for this. You can sit in on hearings, you can watch floor sessions, you can speak up in public comment." And so I went and grabbed a little brochure and I looked up my assemblyman, who at the time was Pat Hickey. I looked up his phone number, I picked up the phone, called him, and guess what? He answered. Not an assistant, not an intern, not a staffer, not an attaché. And he actually sounded happy to hear from a constituent. And I thought, what kind of state do we live in? This is absolutely amazing. And so one thing led to another after 3 terms of advocating for education and eventually for child abuse prevention, something deeply important to me. My assemblyman decided to retire, and I threw my hat in the ring and served 3 terms. And even though I served during what we'll see in a minute charted out as some of the most tumultuous times and times of increasing divide, I will say that after 3 terms, I felt that my faith and confidence in the institution actually strengthened as a result of being there. Because what I can tell you from not only my firsthand anecdotal experience, but also the data backs this up, that in any given session, in 120 days, our 63 plus 1 are considering anywhere from 1,100 to 1,500 bill draft requests. Out of that, on average, about 700 to 800 of them turn into votes on the floor that get sent over to the governor. And out of that 700 to 800, approximately 55 to 65% pass unanimously in both houses, and between 85 and 95% passed with bipartisan support. And that's something that we don't often hear about, because we tend to focus the most on the most highly emotional, contentious, complicated, and divisive issues. And we forget that there are really good people, good public servants on both sides of the aisle who are working to get the job done. And so we are going to talk very realistically about some of the challenges that we're facing today in Carson City, in our state, and in our nation. But I also want to always ground us in the amount of good work that our public servants are doing and how we can help support them in continuing to do that work. So I'd like to move on to some research before we dive into research here at home. Out of the University of Virginia and Vanderbilt, we brought in the Center for Effective Lawmaking for a Guinn Center event 2 weeks ago. And they've been studying the habits of effective lawmakers going back 40 years at the federal level, and then they've decided to start studying states, and guess what? We're one of them. And so they looked at who are the most effective lawmakers over the last 30 years in the state of Nevada at passing substantive and significant legislation. And they found, not only did they find a long list of effective lawmakers in our state and analyzed what are some of their best habits. Their full research is going to come out in 2026, so be on a lookout for it. But one of the things that was really interesting is as they looked back at Nevada, they found that Nevada was an outlier for many, many years, for decades, as being very collaborative, as bucking the trends of the national divides. And it didn't matter so much if you were in the majority or the minority in your ability to effectively pass legislation. And we didn't align ourselves so drastically differently in ideological expressions or declarations until over the last 10 years, we've started to see that sadly, our more collaborative, more local and Nevada-focused politicians have gone the way of becoming more polarized on both sides. And so what we're going to talk about is a little bit of the research that Dr. Amy Pason has done in this area and some of the reasons behind that. And then more importantly, how do we bring dignity into this discussion in order to bring us back to the Nevada that we have been so proud to be for so long. But first, I want to take us to almost the other side of the world, to Rwanda. In 2022, my husband and I took our daughters on a trip of a lifetime. Ever since I watched Diane Fossey and Gorillas in the Mist, I have always wanted to go to Africa. And so we spent some time in Tanzania as a family and then to Rwanda. And we made a stop in Kigali. Kigali is the capital of Rwanda, and many of you may remember in 1994 the epicenter of one of the most egregious genocides in our living history, where in 100 days, a million Hutus and Tutsis were murdered by the hands of their countrymen and countrywomen. And that it was the Tutsis by the hand of the Hutus and the moderate Hutus that were the ones that were slayed. And this was instigated by outside forces. It was definitely, fuel was put on the flame by Belgium that benefited from the divisiveness within that country. It also was met with technological advancements, if you will, in communication, with the invention of talk radio, where talk radio would spread these messages of otherism about your neighbors, your coworkers, the people living down the street, that if they were a certain nationality, that they were evil, they were cockroaches, they were dehumanized in your eyes. And that rhetoric led to such a level that it erupted in the massacre of 1 million of Rwandans during that 100-day period. And so one of the most profound moments for us as a family was when we went to the Genocide Museum Memorial in Kigali. And we didn't mean to, but we ended up spending almost 2/3 of the day there, so much so that the clerk at the front desk stopped us and said, I noticed that you came in first thing this morning, and you're just now leaving. Thank you. And we stood above a grave of 300,000 Rwandans, and we were shooken with silence. We got into the car, we talked to our driver, and my husband said, is this real? Did this really just happen a generation ago? And how is it that you're functioning today? And he said, it's real. My sister and 3 of my cousins are buried there. And he said, how can you possibly go on as a country? And he said, we are Rwandans, and we have gone through the process of forgiveness and repair. And then I learned about one of the most unbelievable criminal justice reforms I've ever heard of, where they brought in ministers from Tanzania because there was too many offenders to lock them all up. They'd lock up 1/3 of the country. And so apart from those who engaged in the most horrific of the war crimes, they, to the extent they were willing to participate, they brought some of the offenders out. They would match them with the families of the victims, and they held these ceremonies in their front lawns. And it would go something like this. I murdered your brother. I murdered your father. I murdered your daughter. Please forgive me. And they would forgive them. And then they integrated them into the same communities where they lived together, and they worked together. They adopted the national motto of "We are Rwandans." They eliminated the focus and even the labeling of Hutus and Tutsis. They developed a national program for community service where 1 day a month everybody comes out, they clean the streets, they do community service side by side together. They invested in education, and education in innovative areas like technology. And today, Rwanda has the highest GDP, the fastest growing and improved education system, K through 12 education system, and Kigali, the epicenter of the genocide, is considered the cleanest and safest city in the entire African continent. And so we left deep in thought, and we left asking ourselves, how do we avoid that road? How do we learn from those lessons? How do we do better so that we don't carry on this path where we're dehumanizing one another? And then I was invited to a speech by an adorable woman who used to be a city council woman who gave a talk about the Dignity Index and the work that they were doing in Utah to assess dignity in our communication in political rhetoric, particularly in campaigns, how we talk about each other, how humanizing or dehumanizing we are. And I was hooked. And so I reached out to my good friend, Dr. Amy Pason, who I consider an expert in the area of political rhetoric, who has been studying polarization, studying the way that we communicate about politics and to one another, and asked her if she would be interested in taking on this project on a deeper level. And she, along with another professor of philosophy, have been studying our political rhetoric here in the state of Nevada and looking at it according to the 8-point Dignity Index scale. So I'm very, very excited to introduce Dr. Amy Pason, who will be sharing with you some more about the trends of polarization that we've witnessed over time and what are some of the underlying causes. And then my good friend, Pat Hickey, who is not only a good friend and a mentor to me, Uncle Pat to my daughters, my former assemblyman, but also a distinguished author who, after leaving office, came from a background in journalism and then came back to it, published for how many years now?
Almost 5.
Almost 5 years, Memo from the Middle, discussing how do we come together when we talk about these issues. And he also is an author of an excellent book called Here and the Hereafter, What Notable Nevadans Have to Say About Life and What's to Come, where he, very interesting way, interviewed notable Nevadans around the state and their thoughts about their life and the afterlife. So with all of that, I'd like to pass the baton to Dr. Amy Pason.
And I think this mic is on. So you all have a handout, and we are going to come back to that at the end of the presentation. But really, the Dignity Index, it was designed by Tammy Pfeiffer, as Jill was alluding to, that they really wanted a very simple way for us to have more awareness of the language that we use. And the more that we have awareness of the language that we use ourselves, but also the language that we are consuming, if you are on social media a lot, for example, if you are watching some of our cable TV news stations, you are going to be hearing things that become more normal about how we should speak with one another. But once we start looking at this scale, we recognize that we don't have to say things the way that we are getting accustomed to hearing things. So we're going to come back to the scale. But before we do that, I wanted to just give and set the scene and the context. Because when we talk about polarization, it's a term that gets thrown around a lot. After different election cycles, we also start to say, well, we're more polarized than ever. We've been saying that we're more polarized than ever since the early 2000s, at least. So let's kind of get a grapple on what we mean by being polarized, especially when we think about our political topics, right? Basically, polarization means that instead of there being a continuum of views that we have, right? So either on one side, you are very much against closed borders, no immigration, and on the other side, you say, let everybody in. But then we know that more people are finding a space along that continuum between those two opposites. When we talk about polarization, it means that if we're surveying our public, how many people are in the strongly agree with this one category or the strongly disagree with this other category? And the more that we don't have folks that are identifying with positions along that continuum, the more that we say that we're polarized. But again, this is something that we've been talking about for a long time. Cass Sunstein is a law professor at Harvard, and he was writing about this in the early 2000s. That's the reference up there in terms of Republic.com 1.0, and then he did a follow-up 2.0. And his worry was that with the advent of the internet, with the ability for us to not all read the same newspapers, to not all watch the same local news at 5 o'clock or whichever late cast that you might prefer, that we're starting to get farther and farther apart because we can just choose the things that we like. And he's a big proponent of the First Amendment, and he thinks it's great for us to be exposed to ideas that we might not agree with or that we hadn't thought about before. So his worry was that we're going to become more polarized the more that people are just talking with like-minded others and finding like-minded others. Because when you talk with like-minded others and that's all you're hearing, you start to take those more polarized views. So it's something we've been talking about a while. On the political rhetoric and political communication research side, talking about polarization is great, but then they also started talking about how our negative political campaigning had been increasing. And it hadn't really been increasing, but we've seen some differences. But also, as social scientists, they couldn't really decide on a definition about what they meant by a negative campaign ad. Was it just that you were attacking your opponent and saying, I don't like your policy? Or was it that you were potentially calling them names and something more insidious than that? So they started to look at civility as that concept, right? And civility can be in a whole lot of different things. It could mean general politeness. Did you not call somebody a name or say that they were very deceitful, right? And you just said that, I think maybe you're not telling the truth. Well, that's helpful, kind of, but again, doesn't necessarily get at the level of why are we becoming more polarized? Why would we try to seek out folks with like-minded views? And even at that stage, civility is an understudied topic. And so that's where a lot of this research ended up. So it's not to say that these are not unimportant concepts, but it is to recognize that polarization or talking about how we need to talk more civilly or politely to one another doesn't quite get to the whole picture. And so we have seen a bit of a difference from what was talked about with Cass Sunstein and polarization to what we're seeing today. So I'm going to look at some other smart folks coming out of the Annenberg School at the University of Pennsylvania. They did a pretty comprehensive study. It's a book, Democracy Amid Crisis, Polarization, Pandemic, Protests, and Persuasion. And they studied various groups within the electorate for the 2020 election. Right? Why were people really voting the ways that they were voting? What was really motivating them? They looked at a whole bunch of different aspects. And so one of their starting points was really to say, do we really have some very different worldviews, right? So that's why I put the CBS YouGov poll from August up there. And this was also part of where these researchers were coming from. How can we take something like the economy, which, again, most of us can say that there are some objective ways that we can think about the economy, the actual money that you're taking home, the actual numbers in terms of unemployment, but they saw that there were some very different versions of how Republicans were seeing the economy. Was it good versus Democrats? Or we take something like, and again, this was the 2020 election, something like COVID, right? We hear the numbers of how many folks died because of COVID during this time. And so just an opinion. How many people said that that was an acceptable amount of deaths to COVID because of how we handled it or not? And you can see up there some pretty stark divides. 57% of Republicans say that COVID deaths, that was acceptable, but much different with only 10% of Democrats and only 33% of independents. Right? So where are we getting that kind of information? And so what these scholars said is that, well, part of the reason is that a partisan identity is becoming much more salient for people. And what they meant by that is that instead of saying, I'm a member of my faith community, I'm a member of my bowling club, I'm a member of the folks that come out to Sierra Nevada forums, is that more people were finding spaces of belonging based on a political identification. And when they see things in terms of a political identification, that means they're looking to folks like our elected leaders to say, well, how am I supposed to understand something like the economy? How am I supposed to understand something like COVID? And so instead of looking at facts, we're looking at things through a partisan framework. My partisan view, based on the folks that are part of my political party, say it's this way. And that's what they were seeing were getting embedded with the attitudes. But there's kind of a brighter light, sort of, in this sense, is that they also noticed that it wasn't as simple as saying, these are the folks that voted for Trump, and these were the folks that voted for Biden in the 2020 election, is that it was much more complicated. They said there were a few folks, or they were folks on one end that were unwavering Trump supporters. And they said that there were few folks that were the unwavering Biden supporters. And they were very different from other folks who were finding themselves in the middle of a wavering Biden supporter, of a wavering Trump supporter, of some folks that were voting for people not of those two. So there were many electorates, and what they got down to is that these many electorates were different because of the media that they were consuming. So just highlighting up there that the unwavering Trump supporters were folks that were actively seeking out conservative media sources, actively avoiding other types of sources, actively avoiding some of our legacy media, the New York Times, the Washington Post, those types of sources. And so their worldview was very different, the stories about how they were making sense of some of these things in the election, right? There's a group called More in Common, and they've been working since 2016. And so they also kind of took on this question and said that the majority of Americans are in the middle. Turns out that the problem that we're seeing is that there are some very loud and strong voices at the extremes. Those are the folks that tweet the most. Those are the folks that are on social media. Those are the folks that are going to be on your cable news shows. And that we are taking our cues from them, even though most people are finding themselves in the middle. And most people, from their surveys, 3 out of 4, believe that the differences between us are not as great as we make them out to be. One last quick thing, and since you all are from Northern Nevada, we know that we do have some concerns because these extreme ends are also starting to speak in more violent ways or taking violent action. In Washoe County, we've had our own issues, especially with folks that have done death threats with our election workers, that we do have some of our more active activists who are sending out mailers and trying to actively get folks out of office, so that we're driving the folks who are the actual moderates or in the middle out of office because the personal risk is too high. So how do we walk our way back from that? So with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to somebody who has lived through this, with Pat Hickey.
Thank you, everyone. Nice to be here. I happen to have been born in Carson, so it's nice to come home. I live in Reno. I actually grew up at the lake, but we didn't have a hospital then, so I got dropped off at Carson Tahoe. But you heard that I've done a column for the Reno Gazette Journal. I formerly did one for the Nevada Appeal, and for those old Carsonites who've lived here long enough to remember Guy Shipler, I was the columnist that followed him, and that was those were awfully big shoes to fill, and a wonderful opportunity. I got elected afterwards, but the most recent column, I just want to tell you again, the name Memo from the Middle was suggested by someone else you know, Warren LaRue, the Pulitzer Prize winner and, from the Reno Gazette Journal, and my mentor and a professor at UNR in the journalism program. But some have said there's no such thing as in the middle anymore. The only thing in the middle are yellow lines and dead jackrabbits if you're a Nevadan. And that's really, though, not entirely true, because what I found while serving in the legislature, which is what I want to talk to you about, but since then is that most people, as I think was mentioned by our professor, are possibly left of center or right of center, but means they're more in the middle than they are on the extreme opposites, which tend to contribute to the rhetoric, the dialogue, and the polarization. And yet their influence upon political parties in particular, meaning those on the more extreme polarized sides, are significant, and they're contributing, I think, to a lot of the divide that we're all dealing with. But just remembering back, I have kind of unique history in that I served in the legislature back in the old days and in recent times. I was two different periods. You think I would have learned my lesson the first go-around, but I didn't. But I served there in the 90s when Bill Raggio and Joe Dini were in leadership, and then more recently, so having been in 2 centuries and 2 decades, I guess it gave me a perspective. One of the things, a recent book by John L. Smith, many of you read John's stuff about Richard Bryan, who was our governor and senator, and reflecting in the book that he was just written about him, My Life in Nevada Politics. Governor Bryan said back in those days, in the 1969 legislature, he said that there was virtually no partisanship at all. He said there were constituent differences, there were philosophical differences that members of both parties had, there were sectional differences, being Nevadans. There is that place down south that we do have some issues with, but the party lines were not etched in stone. And he talked about how actually there were no political caucuses back then. Yes, people were R's or D's, but they met more frequently in Jack's Bar, which has been somewhat restored down the street here, than they did in caucus meetings that fast forward now end up, by caucuses I mean Republicans meet together routinely for long times, and Democrats do the same, sometimes longer than they actually are on floor sessions in debate, and they're trying to hammer out positions and bring everyone in line and herd their members into one particular point of view. And that was very different when I was first there. As a freshman, and that time the Republican leader, because I was a Republican and I happen to be a nonpartisan now, like many Nevadans and practically a majority of Nevadans, in fact. But the Republican leader at that time was from Gardnerville, Lynn Hetrick. And I, as a freshman, got to the point at the end of the session and decided to vote against the budget for some particular reason that I had. It wasn't going to make a hill of beans difference in the whole thing. It was, of course, going to pass, and one of those bipartisan measures. And the powers that be took time out and came over, and various people in leadership from both parties talked with me and said, you know, Hickey, if you do that, you're not going to have a very good future, especially with fundraising the next section, and gave me various reasons why it really wasn't a smart thing to do. But what I really want to say is that my party leader at that time said to me, after everyone talked, he said, vote your conscience. And I thought, you know, that's what leadership should be. And he was someone, along with Joe Dini, one of the most interesting sessions of all. It was the one before I was there. I was a reporter, and so I covered it for the Nevada Appeal at the time, was the 1995 session when you had Democrat Governor Bob Miller. You had Senate Republicans led by legendary Bill Raggio from Reno. And the Assembly, with 42 members, was equally divided in the election outcomes with 21-21, which resulted in there being a shared speakership between the Democrat and the Republican, Dini and Hetrick, and shared chairmanships for each committee. So there was a Democrat and a Republican that were co-chairs, which then necessitated they had to talk with one another. They had to reach a compromise. They had to reason with each other, and it turned out to be I think one of the more successful sessions of all, because it just happened that they had to act together. And there was even a time back then when one party would appoint a chairman of a committee from another party, even though they were in the majority and they had the power to exercise that in their appointments of committee chairs that, as many of you know, have a great deal of power. But there was a time, and when Republicans took over after the 2014 legislature, I was actually the minority leader, majority leader for a short time, and scheduled to be speaker, but I made a fateful mistake in that I suggested we probably ought to give, since we, Republicans in this case, had not been in power for so long, we ought to give a chairmanship to a very prominent Democrat who had been the speaker before, Marilyn Kirkpatrick, who was very fair to Republicans when I was minority leader, and someone we greatly admired on both sides of the aisle, that we ought to give her a chairmanship of one of the committees, Government Affairs, that she was so very knowledgeable about. Well, that doomed my chances, and thank God it did in leadership. But back then, so a big problem is leadership itself. We can talk about the polarized things and the impact that social media and media has upon the views and the divides that are a result. But back then it was ultimately, and the solution will come from leadership. Back then, Bill Raggio and Joe Dini from different parties would meet before, during, and after every legislative session. And they had agendas in mind. They knew what their differences were, but they'd already agreed, at least in principle, that certain things were going to pass on both sides of the aisle. Today, it's hard to get the governor or leaders in the same room unless you're Jill Tolles in the Guinn Center that just had Governor Lombardo and our Speaker Yeager in the same room at one of the Guinn recent event. Couple things, and then we're going to move on. But here's a couple suggestions that I think. Well, a couple things to note and a couple suggestions. We are seeing a growing nonpartisan or independent, if you will, plurality in this state. Now, that hasn't resulted in any significant, but there are more nonpartisan voters. Some's due to the motor voter and younger voters, which are significant, not identifying with either major party and not registering as a result thereof. And so they're more nonpartisan. It hasn't resulted in nonpartisan candidates, but it has shown both parties, on both sides of the aisle, that they've got to appeal to nonpartisan voters. And that was really evidenced in the last statewide election, where you had 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans elected. And I was proud at the time, and I think I felt like a lot of Nevadans. I endorsed in my column the support for 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans on the statewide level, and they're the ones that were in there. It was easy to me because I think Nevadans and people in general, they want balance. They want to see that there's a center of some sort that can go back and forth and negotiate and reason and agree if you have to. And so that was evidence of that I think was very positive. I don't like to call it the divided government, but the fact that both sides can and need to work together. One couple suggestions I would make is the Secretary of State in many other states is a nonpartisan office. It's not in Nevada. The Secretary of State's the chief election officer, and we've had significant problems, as you know, in 2020, and it took the courage in this instance of one Secretary of State who was noted in the research as being successful, although she was very conservative, but that was Barbara Sagaski, who stood up to her own party over some of the allegations that were unfounded and unproven about the 2020 election having been stolen in Nevada. So you have to have courageous politicians willing to stand up, and I would urge the person I endorsed, and a lot of people support, and Cisco, our current Secretary of State, he might be faced with the same challenge, for example, and having to deal with what seems to be an overwhelming sense that we ought to get all of our election results counted before 7 or 10 days after the election. It not only embarrasses Nevada, but it makes a lot of things problematic. But that's my own plug for that. And finally, I'll just leave you with 2 quotes about where we're at. One from an academic side where, let's get it. This is the historian, I'm sorry. Yeah, the 4th turning is here. Neil Howe, an American historian. Some may have heard him, but here's what he recently said about where we're at and the things Jill and our professor were talking about. Personal identity is likewise balkanizing us into self-referential fortresses such as ethnicity, gender, religion, region, education, and of course, politics. Or maybe it would be better just to say what Jonathan Haidt in The Righteous Mind, talking about the 2 mindsets between the various worldviews, or the 2 worldviews, where he said, the struggle between for and against is the mind's worst disease. And I guess that's what we're talking about tonight. Thank you.
And so, yeah, when we talk about politics, and obviously when we are voting, it is a competition, right? Not everybody can be the elected official. And so we do have this us versus them concept. And so that was one thing that was really interesting about the Dignity Index, is that it doesn't quite say that we don't have to have some of those divides. We're still going to identify with our team, our side, but it's how we engage with the other side that matters. So the concept of dignity that they work from, Tammy Pfeiffer and her group who built the Dignity Index, they looked at a book from Donna Hicks that is called Dignity. They also looked at a book from Arthur Brooks that is called Love Your Enemy. So the scale is actually based on how do we engage in conflicts with those that we disagree with. And Donna Hicks was somebody who had done some conflict mediation in Northern Ireland, in other war-torn countries. And what she noticed is that there was one key factor about when negotiations between sides would break down. There would always be some kind of an emotional outburst. There would be something that things were going great based on the facts and based out agreements that they were doing, but then talks would stop. And what she discovered and what she really dug into was that the thing that people were walking away from these negotiating tables were when they would say things like, "You don't understand me. You're not listening to me. You're not seeking to understand my perspective or side on this issue." So that's where she centered on this concept of dignity. So when we talk about dignity, it means that we are recognizing the inherent worth that we all have from birth, and that I treat you with dignity because I see myself in you, right? We respect each other just on the basis that we are all human beings. We might disagree, but we also want to just take that first step in that we are all here and we all belong. So when we're talking with somebody with dignity in mind, it means that we do not think that there's one group that is more superior to another, or one group that is more inferior to another, right? We're all just groups. We have some different interests. It also means that we're taking some commitment to recognizing a principle of inclusion. We all belong. We all got to kind of find a way to work together. And that we also have a commitment in our communication to seek to understand the other side. So these are kind of big asks. The other side of dignity is contempt. So you can see on your scale, if you're up on the 8 side, this is where we're in the dignity side. We respect others, we seek inclusion, we seek to understand. At the 1 side is contempt. Contempt being that we feel disdain and disgust for another person. And when we get into the situation that Jill was describing in terms of Rwanda, that we start talking about people as if they're cockroaches. They need to be destroyed. They're less than human. They don't deserve to be around. So our very language sets up these conditions for us. So the index was created. They used it in the 2022 elections to see whether or not this was going to be a tool that most people could use. Could you hear a quote from a politician? And were people rating it the same on this index scale? They expanded it this year in this election cycle where they had the National Citizens Forum. So they had, I think, about 80 folks that were participating from all across the political spectrum. So they would watch the presidential debates and everybody would score. They would be looking at TV advertisements from the presidential election and everybody would do some scores on different quotes that they would pull from it. And what they found is that regardless of your political party, whether or not you're liberal or conservative, that people were rating the quotes the same. So if somebody was talking with disdain for another person, if they were mocking them, if they were name-calling them, that we were rating them the same. We can identify and we can recognize when we are showing dignity to others or when we're showing contempt. So there was some variations, but not a whole lot of variations, as you can see from the score there. The differences between how people were scoring was very minimal. But what they also have noticed in that using this scale, right, kind of having the 1 to 8 just kind of up on their computers or up on their screens, is that we start to recognize the language that we use ourselves. So you can see some quotes there from some of their National Citizens Group participants. "I noticed it significantly more on social media, which seems to be filled with contempt," one of their participants said, right? So we also know that there's spaces where we tend to show contempt more to others or take strong positions because that seems to be normal. So if we can catch ourselves and start talking in a different way, we can get others to follow our lead. So you've got the scale in front of you, and there's one that is kind of a more in-depth guide in terms of giving us some of these differentiations. But again, just to get us a sense on what we're talking about here, the scale is really taking us on a continuum of some us versus them policies. And again, this is typical when we are doing election campaigns. Vote for us because they don't have the best policies. Vote for us because we're on the right side of this issue, not them. So this is just how we do persuasion generally. But it is about how we're describing the us versus them that matters. So if we're on that one end, the us versus them is the them doesn't deserve to live, right? To the extent that we might even endorse, we must attack them, we must kill them, we must do all of those things to that end. Or are we talking about the them as that they are evil? They take on these qualities even to the extent that we might actually, reference things that we identify with evil. They're hellish, they're a villain, they are dangerous in particular ways, they are threatening to our way of life, but not necessarily, we don't want to harm them yet. Are we talking about the them in that way, right? As we move up the scale then, we get to those stages more in the 5s or the 6s that, yes, there's an us versus them, but I'm willing to understand why they take a position. I still think mine is better, but their position is still a valid one that we must consider, right? A much different language than they are dangerous and we must destroy them all, right? So what we want to see is that more of our political language is in that category that is reaching into the 7s or 8s would be great. Realistically, in terms of campaign discourse, we're more in we would hope for the 5s or the 6s. In some of the preliminary research that I've been doing with students at UNR and also a philosophy faculty, that we were looking at the campaign discourse of our state legislators just down the street here, that we were trying to see where are they posting, where is their discourse at, what is typical. And so we were seeing a lot of the things that are in the 4s, some 5s on the scale, but very different versions that we see on the website is much more in the 5 category than what we see on social media oftentimes. So that's the basis of the scale. The Dignity Index, and there were some other handouts at the table out in front, they have a whole lot of different tools. So if you just Google Dignity Index, you can go to their resource page. So they actually have kind of statements. Well, how do we actually have these conversations with others, or even discussion starters if you want to have a community group sit down together and talk through issues. They give you some guiding questions so that we can start practicing talking with one another with dignity. So this is the portion that we want to get you to start being familiar with the Dignity Index, right? As an educational tool, how are we going to make sure that we are paying attention to the language that we use? So I'm going to do some examples that come from the Dignity Index and their National Citizens Forum, and then I'll show some examples that we are pulling just from some of our local politics. So let's look at this example. This is an example from the presidential debate, and this is what Donald Trump had to say about Kamala Harris. She's destroying this country, and if she becomes president, this country doesn't have a chance of success. Not only success, will end up being Venezuela on steroids. So audience member, anyone want to venture a guess on what this might score? I've got somebody that's holding up a 2. We've got some 2s, we've got some 3s, we've got some folks that want to go off the scale. So if you're looking at it, the Dignity Index for folks said most people of their survey said that this was going to be a 2. And the 2, because we've got that strong language of destroying the country, right? So they are going to ruin everything in that kind of categorization. Will end up being Venezuela, some place that we don't want to be on steroids, so very much in that lower category. Some of their participants said that, well, this is a really serious issue, and so we shouldn't be just kind of flippant about talking about serious issues, was why they put things more in the bottom category. Again, if some of you were putting it at a higher level, right? I mean, there is some variation with this scale. And so, again, the context matters. And that's one of the pieces that my colleague and I are trying to work through. It's hard to separate sort of what we know historically or actions people have taken from their actual words. So let's look at another example. So this was a TV ad for the Harris campaign. When people tell me they don't believe in Vice President Harris, I point them to the things that I'm doing, and when they're excited about me, you know, working with kids, I say I can't do this without the grant that came from the federal government. She's had our back since day one. And so this was a community organizer that was speaking in a campaign ad. So where might we put this ad? Anyone want to venture where this might be on the scale? We've got 6s and 7s that I'm hearing. And if you like this game, if you go to the Dignity Index website, they have the Daily Dignity where they give you a quote and you get to pick the number. Train ourselves in this. So their national poll put this more at the 5. So really kind of touting the good things in terms of the federal government here. She's had our back. And so that would be, again, where they might stick it more in that 5 category because they're still recognizing there is a different side. There's an our side, and then there's other sides that are disagreeing with us, but not necessarily in that sense that they might be making fun of or trying to discount the other side. Just saying, we're going to focus on the our side. So nothing really that's telling us that they're speaking to the other side, just acknowledging it. So let's go to some Nevada politics. So we've got this statement here. State Republicans in Nevada are fighting for greater transparency in the Silver State, but Democrats are blocking common sense ethics reforms. This isn't surprising, as Nevada Democrats have been mired in scandal after scandal over the past year. The hypocrisy is stunning. This was an ex-post from the Better Nevada PAC, so kind of looking at a more partisan source. Where would we put this one at? We've got some 4s, some folks are going down in the 3 category, so we're pretty consistent in that respect. So this one I might stick in terms of that 4 category, again, depending on how strongly we take some of these views. So we do say that we are better than others in terms of that we Republicans are fighting for transparency, but obviously they're trying to say that the other side shouldn't be listened to. They're mired in scandal, there's hypocrisy, but not so much that they're saying that the other side is a threat. They're just hypocrites, so it's a less of a threat in that sort of a sense. So that's maybe where we point this. This was an interesting one. Sam Brown is a MAGA extremist who is stumbling in the general election after running to the far right fringes of his party, pursuing a radical agenda. So the Nevada Dems on their website had a bunch of press release type posts, and so this was a pretty typical statement that we were noticing on that side. So where might we stick this one at? I see some 3s holding up in the audiences, some that are more in the 2 side, some 3 sides. So you guys are thinking in the same direction that I was. Probably put this in the 3. This is where we were kind of saying, well, they're saying the same thing over and over again. How much can you just label somebody a MAGA extremist and you repeat it until it doesn't actually mean anything anymore to us? So we might say that this one is more in the 3 side. We're not necessarily seeing Sam Brown being talked about as evil, but we're definitely saying that there's more of a threat. The extremist language, very typical. We got either the radical right on one side or the radical left, or this extremist language was being used a lot. It becomes really meaningless when we start doing this. Well, what's the actual policies? And probably for many of you, I couldn't name you anything that Sam Brown was running on issue-wise because we got the label just kind of repeated over and over again. So some of the taste of Nevada politics is just, again, giving us some quick examples here. But one thing that we probably should be concerned with, and these I think are typical but not as bad as maybe some of you remember this from the primaries. Jeff Gunter was running against Sam Brown in the primaries, and there was a TV ad of which we were talking about the newest creature to emerge from the swamp. And this was a fun one when I was teaching this to my students as we were learning this index, because when we're saying, well, do we really have folks that are talking about people in ways that dehumanize them, that are in these extreme circumstances? And in this case, they were really kind of playing up Sam Brown's scarring in terms of having swamp goo all over him and Mitch McConnell. And again, kind of knowing that Sam Brown is a veteran, this is where my students were like, well, this is exactly what we were talking about in this 1-2 category. Even though it was stylized, it was more of a cartoon sense. So one thing for us to also pay attention to is that, sometimes things that we might say are stylistic, they still have effects to them, right? If this is the thing that we're used to seeing, the more we see ads like this, the more that is what's going to get more attention. So we're just going to continue to see those things unless we decide to shut those types of things off. Couple more examples, and then we'll kind of open ourselves up to questions. So just thinking of our recent local politicians. This is from one of our current assembly members. In this election, we have so much at stake, but we also have an opportunity to finally put people ahead of special interests and stop the rise of right-wing extremism. Will you join me? Where do we think that we put this one at? I see some 5s. I heard a 6 or a 7. I hear a lot of discussions on here. This is one of those areas where we say, well, there's a really positive message, but then there's this line at the end. So does that line at the end discount what is overall kind of a positive message to begin with? And so for our group, we might stick this one more at the 4 just because of that right-wing extremist comment at the end, right? So how do we kind of maintain and have a consistent message with our dignity index? So here's another one that, again, we saw less harsh language on campaign websites as people were talking about their issues. So again, depending on where you are going for your information on candidates, you're going to get a different picture. Rural health care access continues to be an issue in our communities. Our healthcare industry has the potential to drive growth and create new and exciting jobs for hardworking Nevadans. Unfortunately, Democrats want to create a single-payer system that will increase premiums and drive doctors out of Nevada. What do we think about that one? I hear some 4s. Seeing some 4s. Got a 5. Got somebody saying 7. We've got taking a position here. Yeah, again, there's going to be variation. It's not a perfect system in that sense. But this would be one of those that our team would put more at the 5, or what we would say is what we're aiming for in some of our campaign discourse, right? Because you have to differentiate yourself from some of your opponents. So this one we felt did keep more towards the issue, right? That we were saying that there's a rural health care issue, single payer is a different position, and that the Democrats take that position, but nothing that necessarily is saying that they are terrible people for doing it, just that there is a consequence to the policy. So we might put it in that category. Depending if you like the policy or not, we might have some different views. And last example over here, Trump is a criminal and extremist hellbent on further rolling back our freedoms, promises to be a dictator on day one. We can't and won't let him take back the White House. This was something that would just kind of a typical post on social media. Probably some of you have seen it. Where would we stick this one at? We got lots of folks saying 2. Yeah, I would say that this one is definitely at the 2 category. And the dignity index is not necessarily saying that we cannot be critical of other folks, right? If somebody is saying racist things, if somebody is doing policies that do actually harm us because it's costing us money or it's taking away health care or shutting down systems that we like, it's not that we can't disagree. But there's a difference between saying this policy is going to hurt us in these specific ways. There's a difference between saying, yes, Trump was convicted in this case, those types of things, but we don't necessarily need to go whole in on the hell-bent extremist. And in fact, what we would suggest otherwise, instead of just focusing on the negatives of the other side, let's give folks a vision about where they can go in the future. So if that's not the vision that we want, then what's the vision that you're going to offer to us? And again, you can kind of point out the bad sides of that. So with that, hopefully just having the index on hand, that you'll be able to start looking at some of the political discourse in a different way. And instead of engaging with others and saying, well, that person is terrible, you can say, hey, I don't think that person is showing dignity, right? If they're lying to us, that's not dignity to us as an audience. If they're making fun of their opponent, is that really the leader that we want to have? Did you want to go with your?
Sure.
Okay, yes.
So thank you for that. And I'll just close this up with a couple final thoughts, and if we have time for questions, we can open that. But, you know, I know Dr. Amy Pason because I taught in the Communication Studies department at UNR for 17 years, and for many of those years I taught debate, and we would spend the first 3 weeks actually talking about civility, and that the purpose of debate is not to destroy each other. It's to get closer to truth and closer to the best policy moving forward, and that you can vehemently attack the issue, and you can even passionately disagree while still respecting the person that you're disagreeing with. And so one of the things that I appreciated about the Dignity Index was how it just made us more self-aware of our own language, and that as more and more people are more self-aware, that can help turn a tide. And also that there was some preliminary findings that in Utah, when they started to do some public awareness around dignity and the use of dignity language and the use of dehumanizing language in campaigns, that it actually had a little bit of a chilling effect of politicians using that kind of language, and had some positive results. So I wanted to add to that a couple more thoughts just to close us out, that in addition to thinking about our language and how we can be more civil and attack the issue and not the other, we did, as I mentioned, have the Center for Effective Lawmaking come in a couple weeks ago for our Gallagher Dialogue, which is an annual event we have at the Guinn Center. And I think part of it is thinking about our language and then refocusing on what does it mean to be effective lawmakers. And some of their findings I thought I would share with you was that the most effective lawmakers over the last 40 years and 30 years here in Nevada developed legislative agendas rooted in personal background and previous experiences and policy expertise. So again, bringing the issues back to what's in our backyard, what's in our schools, what's in our businesses, what's in our communities, and focusing on those, developing a legislative agenda tightly focused on district needs, being entrepreneurial with positions of institutional power, so thinking through the process and how to effectively utilize the process to get good policy through, be open to compromise, even with those who are not natural allies, that no surprise, cultivating a broad set of allies, even beyond your home chamber, led to success rates. So the more often that you got co-sponsors from both sides of the aisle and both houses, you're exponentially more likely to pass legislation that was substantive and significant. When I did leave office after the 2021 session for a variety of personal and other reasons, I had the privilege of being an Aspen Rodell Fellow at the Aspen Institute, where I gathered with 24 of us actually, 12 Democrats, 12 Republicans, over a series of retreats together. And on my last day, I wrote my top 12 lessons learned from 3 sessions, and I posted it and shared it with the incoming freshman legislative class. And so I thought I'd close us out by sharing some of those reflections to you to bring it on home. And the first observation I made in those 6 years in Carson was, there are noisemakers and there are lawmakers. And my advice to the new legislators, if you're listening to this broadcast, be a lawmaker. Some are there to do the job, and others are there to do the next job. Do the job. Be nice to staff, always. Ask yourself how you will feel about this vote when you are 84. Your critics will be gone or won't care by then. You will get it wrong sometimes. Forgive yourself. Others will get it wrong sometimes. Forgive them. Don't make this your identity. You won't always be in politics, if you're lucky. The state needs more public servants than politicians. Be a public servant. Treat every term like it's your last, because it might be. Conflict, tension, and differences of opinion are all part of the process. Embrace the process. Be grateful for the time you are there. It is an honor to serve, even on the hard days. And last but not least, respect the institution. It will last longer than any of us. And that's to any of you lawmakers watching. Thank you all so much for being here and for caring about dignity and civility and effectiveness in our process.
Did the audience have any questions? The first question is, how does fact-checking fit into the dignity part?
Well, interestingly enough, fact-checking is not part of the index itself in terms of how it was designed. So we're really just looking at the language of things. But this is a question that I'm working through with my colleague because we do think that lying matters. And so we're kind of working out this concept called the dignity snake. So if somebody says it nicely, but they're lying to you about it, is that any better? And so, again, sort of the scale itself is not asking us to do that fact check to see if they're lying. But we also think that dignity towards the audience is important. And since a lot of my other research is on deliberation and how we actually engage with one another to make decisions, and I teach a facilitation class where we're getting students to engage in those ways, that if we want to have a thriving public sphere, a healthy public sphere, that if we've got a lot of lying and garbage in it, and that's coming from our leaders telling us what these policies or these issues are about, that's not showing respect to the voters or the audience that needs to make a decision. So for us, lying does matter. It doesn't neatly fit on the index scale, but it's something that we're contemplating.
Thank you. If you are speaking to someone you know has different views than you, how can you honestly express your opinions without appearing to attack or invite a challenge?
God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth. Use them proportionately. I think that people are more likely to listen to us when we've given them the courtesy of listening to them first. So I think starting with listening, and not just listening passively, but listening actively, paraphrasing back what you heard, asking, did I hear you correctly, gives them permission to engage, be heard, and then be more willing and open to you sharing your perspective. And so asking for permission after you know they felt heard. Would you mind if I share how I view things? And when it comes to conflict, oftentimes we approach it like this, where it's us versus the other person. And I don't know about you, but if somebody's pushing on you, my natural reaction, and just about every single other breathing human I've ever come across, their natural reaction is the same, to push back. And instead of it being us versus the other, me against you, if you can approach a dialogue about differences of opinion as two people sitting side by side at a table and just laying it out and looking at it together, it completely changes the dynamic. And by listening and reflecting back to them and paraphrasing what you heard, and then laying down next to it, here's what I was thinking. What do you think? It just makes it us versus the problem instead of us versus each other.
The next question is, what happens when there's a vast moral divide amongst the people?
Jonathan Haidt has some things to say about that.
Yeah, he certainly. I will tell you this in approaching the column. One time I identified 10 issues that I was going to write about and asked for people's feedback, and these were the typical but important and sometimes challenging issues like abortion or immigration and those things, and wrote columns about it. What I've attempted to do, and I think this is a lesson that those of us in the media need to learn, you need to be genuinely curious and not bring your own biases and point of view into the writing of a story. We all have biases. We all have some place we're coming from. That's understandable. What I have tried to do as a journalist in my columns is to identify as best I could the different positions, because it's not always just two, but it typically is, and then to offer my take on things, whether or not it's in the middle or whether or not it's right. But I think if you genuinely listen to someone else and are curious about what someone else is saying, even on moral issues, for example, when I wrote about right to life, I tried to understand and even say, because someone said it to me, I actually can be both pro-choice and pro-life. In other words, someone can really respect personally what they consider to be the sanctity of life, and at the same time also for someone else agree that that person deserves to have a choice. So sometimes even with difficult moral issues, you can be understanding of the other side, even if you don't, of course, agree with it in instances.
Is there a way for the dignity index to be accepted by both sides and used to promote civility?
I mean, this would be the idea that the Dignity Index folks, they talk about the Dignity Index movement that they are trying to take across. And again, it is just for us to start to develop a new norm of how we should engage in political conversation. It's not partisan. Both sides can talk about their issues without resorting to name calling. When we have leaders who that is their go-to on whatever social media platform that they want to use, we need to start shutting that out instead of sharing it on. There's another political communication professor down at Texas A&M who's written a book about Trump, actually. So she talks about flooding the zone with positivity. So oftentimes on these social media, the contagion of the negativity, right, the name calling and the piling on and the more piling on happens. She suggests that we combat that by positivity. Let's talk about the positive stories about this person, the positive content, even if it's sharing cat memes. But let's just sort of change the conversation in that way. So the challenge is, and actually Tammy Pfeiffer did do a training with the Washoe County commissioners. There were some folks on that she was describing to us that didn't want to stay because they felt that talking about dignity was going to somehow limit the things that they have to say. But again, I think we need to challenge, and we had examples there from PACs on both sides in our Nevada politics. We have to challenge each other to raise the conversation. We don't need to name call, so let's talk about issues instead.
All right, this question says, many people are fearing for their safety and their children's future and are considering even leaving the country. How do you approach that?
Everyone looks to me for the easy question. I'd like to go back and answer the last two questions, please. Actually, I do want to say a couple of things about the last two questions, if I may. So in debate, there's three main questions that debates tend to circle around. There's questions of fact, questions of policy, and questions of value. And oftentimes underneath questions of fact, or particularly under questions of policy, there is always an underlying value. And that person on the other side that you think is fighting on the wrong side of morality may just be fighting for a different value. So they may be pitting things like freedom versus the common good, or things, like justice and fairness and compassion. And so oftentimes it's not that they're amoral or immoral, it's that they're anchoring their arguments in a different value. And again, I think coming to it with curiosity and listening and understanding what that value is and trying to find common ground where that value, where they're coming from on that value is a starting point if you can. And back to the point about positivity, my family on our I promise we're not huge international travelers. We've only really gone on 2 really big trips in the last 5 years, but the other one was just last summer to England. If you were paying, when you were watching, if you happened to catch the news, they were having a series of riots and violence after a young man who actually was not an immigrant, but it was falsely reported that he was a refugee. He was actually born in the country, attacked a class of young students, a dance class, a Taylor Swift dance class. And then that led to riots and protests and violence all across England at the exact same time that we were traveling. And in some ways, we felt like it was following us. Just the cities that we were leaving or close to or traveling to, there were outbreaks of violence, culminating in London the day that they were expecting mass violence to erupt. And they brought in 1,000 police officers, and it was really difficult to get anywhere to our little Airbnb. And we saw the police presence everywhere. And there was a protest that did erupt in the middle of the city, and it was a positive one. It was hundreds of people who came out with positive messages of love and peace, who sang songs, and who stopped any potential other kinds of activities with a protest of love. And it was really inspiring. I'm thinking now that I maybe need to go on more trips with my family because come back with these world lessons just serendipitously. But I understand the anxiety. I do. We hear it all the time from people that we're interviewing for our research, the conversations that we have with citizens, and it's understandable, the fear and the anxiety that people have. And so I think that it's important to be aware that there are a lot of messages right now that are very much engineered to divide us, to cause us to fear one another, to cause us to hate one another, or justify verbal violence or other violence. And I'll give an example that I'm somewhat ashamed of, but I think it's an important one to acknowledge. In 2020, we had, as you know, there was a lot of protests around racial issues and tensions. And what started as a very peaceful protest turned into a violent one in downtown Reno. And it led to some violence and certainly property damage, and it was very frightening and felt very vulnerable. My husband and I own some businesses, and so we had employees out in front of windows just making sure that their businesses weren't going to be broken into and damaged and raided. And so it just really just felt like it just hit so home in our community. And the next morning I was out for a walk with my dog, and I got a text message that said, there's a tweet out there that says, forget the protests down in the city. Let's get them where they live. Let's go to the suburbs. And it was from somebody that, I considered a trustworthy person, not somebody who would typically just spam with, random nonsense. And I'm a graduate of the FBI Citizens Academy, and so I reached out to a friend of mine in the FBI and said, hey, is this real? And he said, yeah, we're looking into it. It hit our radar too. And, so thinking, oh my gosh, this is probably a credible threat, and, better get my dog inside. And I turned to another mom, walking on the path, and I said, hey, I'm not saying this is real or not, but kind of freaky. And we were all still in a little PTSD because we felt so close to home to this violence the day before. So I got home and, I didn't try and think too much more about it. And about a week later, I got a phone call back from my friend in the FBI, and he said, that tweet that you sent me? He said, we actually tracked down the IP address behind it, and it actually was not, and it was claiming to be Antifa that was, putting this message out there. And it was not. It was Indy Europa, which is a Russian-backed white supremacy group that was intentionally trying to stir up fear of otherism. So that exactly what happened of me turning to another suburban, woman and saying, they're coming to our homes, was the fear reaction that was engineered in that moment. And it reminded me of Rwanda. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be very aware, and I'm not by any means, please don't hear in any way, shape, or form that I'm minimizing some very, very real concerns today that we have, and that I don't share them as well. But that any time that we feel fear or anger, as I taught my classes for years when I taught persuasion, doesn't mean that there's not things to be fearful of and there's not things to be angry about. Lord knows there is, and there's times where we need to use our voice as citizens and do what we need to do to fight for those causes against things to be fear and angry about. But the first thing that I would tell anyone is the moment you feel fear, the moment you feel anger, use it as a check and check the source and dive in, ask where that's coming from. Is it factual? Is it true? Is it real? Is it actual? Sometimes it is. I'm not trying to minimize. And save your reserves for when it is so that you can respond in productive ways as citizens of the state of Nevada and the United States. I hope that's helpful.
I might just add on with the Dignity Index, the 8 on the scale really is, are you willing to stand up for somebody who's different than you, even if that is going to bring on attacks from your group? And so I think that's something to really reflect on, especially with some of the things that we are seeing. If someone who, as we saw at Columbia, a student protester who was arrested, might get a green card taken away. I'm a citizen, I'm a faculty member. Would I be willing to stand up for that student? Would I be willing to stand with folks who might be subject to, as we see with immigration issues, harassment from ICE? Am I somebody that's going to stand up for folks who have, within policy, been erased in terms of gender identification? Am I going to change my inclusion of others because I'm worried about myself, right? It's a hard ask, obviously. But again, if we really are going to be committed to ideals of inclusion, committed to recognizing the humanity in others, right? And standing with those folks that might need our support, I think that's also a place to be. And again, if we stand with others, there's going to be fewer and fewer people as we start saying, well, why are you showing that contempt? What's going on? Right? Where's this coming from? Get them to reflect on themselves. And again, there's big things that are somewhat out of our control, with those in power. But again, we can control our local communities. So if we treat each other with respect. There was a hearing with some of the mayors of different cities, especially in asking questions about sanctuary cities and what they are doing in terms of immigration. And I think it was the mayor of Boston that said, we are safer because we support those in our community. We've got problems, we've got challenges, we're figuring it out. So I would say that would be a moment, too, of standing with those that might not be similar to her, but still part of their community. So that's what I would hope to see. And again, if we're aiming more for the 8s on our scale, maybe we can get to that point.
This is the last question. How do policymakers address dignified behavior in campaigns? Is there a way for a legislative solution that does not conflict with the First Amendment?
I was a legislative leader that managed campaigns of various candidates and in fact was successful. I always thought, I think I tried to convey to my colleagues, you never make yourself necessarily look better by trying to make someone else look bad. And it was mentioned earlier that people really want to hear what you're going to do or what you stand for. And I think even people that would vote for you would rather hear that than have you attacking your opponent, even if it's in self-defense and it's tit for tat. So I think they're really successful campaigners keeping it about what their policies, what their priorities, who they are as a person, and why they want to gain your trust in the form of your vote is a far more effective way, ultimately, than getting into a pissing match with the other political side.
But legislatively, what do you think?
You mentioned the First Amendment. That's a really big issue, and so you have to self-govern yourself in a representative democracy like ours, and I think ultimately it would be in the best interest of our political parties to clean up their act. Because they haven't and because they aren't, more and more people are leaving traditional political parties in droves. So maybe that message will get through. I don't know that you can just make more laws against that. The famous saying, where there are no laws, there are no thieves. And the legislature does a pretty good job of making both.
Thank you.
And I would just probably add to that again, what sort of gets media coverage is oftentimes the nasty and the negative. And you want to get free press, right? So if you're gonna say something nasty so that you get media coverage of it, or again, some of our legislative leaders, there's some of the folks that might be retweeting or putting out more information and spreading the negativity that get spread around as well. So, shut out the negativity, go seek out the positivity, and then maybe our candidates will recognize that they can benefit more by being more dignified.
Thank you. Before the forum began, I was given this grassroots organization that's trying to get started about civic engagement. And let's see, they want to call themselves the Civic Engagement Carson City, and they're going to have a meeting. And so if you're interested, there's a place to sign up. Who gave me this? Okay, he's back there. Anyway, thank you so much. It was very good.
Good job.
Joining us. Roping you in here.